Well, thanks everybody for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kevin Ivester. I feel like we know a lot of people on here. Really nice to come out and support Alex. And this is Alex Boeschenstein. Thanks for being here, Alex.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Maybe we could start with the title of the show and sort of how you landed on that.
Yeah, so as you can see, the title of the show is Crosshairs. And I mean, most people kind of understand what that means. It's also kind of like a colloquialism, like if you're caught in the crosshairs, you're, something is fixed on you. You might be in a precarious situation. But, it's usually just this sort of, the cross or cruciform that's in like an ocular device. Or a lens or an instrument for measuring or targeting. And so I was thinking about perception and how we sort of like map the land of the Southwest in particular through these devices and how they've been used historically. So that was kind of I wanted something that was like sort of general enough to capture some of the abstractions, forms, and themes behind the body of work that I was making, and it seemed appropriate. And then there's also so many kind of like crosshair motifs that are littered throughout the actual prints, and there's also a lot of kind of like Rorschach bilateral symmetries and also radial symmetries throughout the work.
The other thing I like about it is the installation, how everything is sort of lined up on this center line, including the stadia rods.
Yeah. So there's a lot of like crosshairs and these kind of like fixation points where things cross over each other and intersect within the work. So there is a kind of like spatial mapping that's happening on the walls and in the space.
When you were making the work, did you already have crosshairs in mind? Because I know that it just happens that like there is this sort of center point or this radial design or this bilateral, design in the majority of the prints, I want to say.
Yeah. Well, I think like this body of work came out of previous bodies of work and is sort of like a distillation and a really I don't know, kind of like reduced down and, like I said, distilled version of like some other projects. And I think like the earliest prints that you actually see in the show, I was thinking about printmaking as this process that exists in a kind of like mirror world of reversals and how to literalize that, and also like kind of have the process of the matrix then being reversed in the final print, leaving this sort of trace of itself behind, but like a mirror world version, actually like kind of creating like a domino effect of reversals, so that as a viewer you're caught in this kind of mirror world that printmakers find themselves in, and how that is dovetailed with some of the themes and histories that I was interested in.
Totally feel that.
Yeah.
And like I think an even harder question to ask is like, what has your work been about? What were these bodies of work that you were making? And like how do you find yourself making work about crosshairs and like, sight lines and
I feel like it's tough in like a more condensed format like this to know exactly what to focus on, and also like artists being put in the position of like interpreting and like articulating their own work is tough. So I'm just saying
I find it really interesting that like you spent so much time in the West, like at Roswell and walking around geoglyphic, you call them geoglyphic land, well,
they're like
sculptures?
Geoglyphs,
geoglyphs.
Yeah, I mean, so to kind of backtrack, like a lot of this work came out of like the work that I was making in grad school, which was kind of focused on the history of sulfur mining in Texas and the political economy of it, but also its like cultural and theological associations as synonymous with brimstone. And I did this whole project that was centered on this sulfur mine in the Permian Basin, which is where it's the sedimentary basin that's producing more oil than any other place in the United States. And sulfur mining, modern sulfur mining as we know it, grew out of the explosion of the fossil fuels industry and was the biggest extractive industry in Texas throughout the 20th century, other than fossil fuels. And so I became it all started because like my friend Shawnee Tomasini gave me a bag of powdered sulfur, and I was just curious about the material and started looking into the material history. And I was like kind of at the same time researching and really fixating on like the prevalence of the geosciences in Texas and how much the sort of like you're surrounded by the material history of the place. And it was something that just struck me when I moved here from Seattle. You know, I hadn't spent any time in the South. And so I was really responding to this new place and trying to like make sense out of my experience here. And so like a lot of my work just more broadly is like very regionally specific and like rooted in place. And so, yeah, like I did this big project on sulfur. I was really interested in its kind of like apocalyptic overtones, but then, you know, found this abandoned sulfur mine in West Texas that I then built this whole project around. And that mine, I then found out the former stewards and the companies that ran it, I discovered were like complicit in some of like the grossest like instances of neo-colonial exploitation throughout the Cold War. And so like
in the US or abroad?
Abroad, yeah. So one of the companies, Freeport-McMoRan, was the first company that got a mining concession from the Indonesian government after the genocide in '65, which was aided by the CIA. And then like Freeport Sulfur, which ran the mine initially, was a subsidiary of Pennzoil, which was the company that you know, provided listening posts for the CIA during the Bay of Pigs. Yeah. And their CEO met with Alan Dulles like 2 nights before the Bay of Pigs because they had a nickel mine in pre-revolutionary Cuba. And I found all these documents at the site that were like, you know, gave you keyhole views into how these companies operate.
So I want to pause that too, because like you literally stumbled upon these abandoned documents and then started flipping through them and saw all this like political research and, you know, what these companies were thinking about specific countries.
There was a whole like 3-ring binder called Country Studies that was literally like a breakdown of all these different countries, mostly in the global South, and basically how amenable they are to like private business interests. And it was clear that they had gotten a lot of the intelligence from that, like from American intelligence agencies.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting read. And to like just find it in an abandoned sulfur mine, which is, what's the environment around a sulfur mine? This is like completely desolate and like out in the middle of nowhere, essentially, right? Yeah,
I mean, they just left a lot of the buildings and detritus and stuff just sprawled across the landscape. And it was at one point like the biggest sulfur mine in the world. So it's a massive operation. The only like evidence of the actual mining is like is the land subsidence. So like, you know, the land dropped in some parts of the basin where the mining was taking place, like over 50 feet. And I talked to the wife of somebody who worked in the mine, who lived in Pecos, which is the closest town. And she said that her husband didn't come home for dinner one night because his truck just like got swallowed by a sinkhole that emerged out of nowhere. So, you know, sulfur mining, they like drill into the ground and they melt the sulfur with superheated water from the ore bodies, like hundreds of meters underground, and then they pull it out in its molten form. So it's not like open pit mining where there's like a huge hole in the ground that they've just dug and then sifted through the ore. They're literally melting it out of the ore and pulling it out. So it's like more kind of covert almost. But then the land, you know, it starts sinking as a result. Yeah. So yeah, it's this really haunted place. And then I made like this video and a book and made this kind of like archive around these fictionalized characters that were based on real characters that I had found out about during my research. And and it was this kind of like, speculative archive of somebody who had become obsessed with the mind, which was just a surrogate for me. Yeah. So that was like my foray into sulfur, and then at the same time I was like kind of thinking about Himalayan sea salt and its relationship to sulfur and some of its overlaps in its material history. And so that's how these sculptures made out of sea salt and sulfur emerged.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I want to get to, but I'm just curious. Like, have you always considered yourself interested in like conspiracy theories and like interested in what our governments are up to? And was that before, or did this project or in this discovery like just put that into overdrive or like ignite it?
I think that I've always been interested in that kind of stuff, and I've always been interested in like the kind of like specters that haunt modern life, the historical specters and absences that sort of like act as virtual agents and influence things, but from the shadows. And I've also long been interested in this like kind of field of radical criminology that called parapolitics, which is like, revolves around research into like the deep state, basically, which is a term that came out of parapolitics, but then was like appropriated by people like Trump and reactionaries and shit. But it's all focused on like this sort of parallel state that exists outside of the public-facing democracies, or underneath it, or however you want to like
literally underneath it.
Yeah. And then when I found, when I started researching this mine and everything, it was like I was getting this direct keyhole view and access into that parallel world that affects so much of the world that we live in, and it also breeds conspiracy and speculation and, incredibly bird-brained, reductive explanations for like what is going on. And what these invisible forces that encroach on our realities are. So anyways, yeah, like that's definitely like a preoccupation.
Yeah.
That cuts through a lot of, but I'm always like, I think the conclusion I usually come to in like my work is like kind of like state of inclusivity or inconclusivity, which is kind of the opposite of conspiratorial explanations.
I do think that
power.
The experience of looking at your work, that there's a bigger story, that there's a lot going on, there's a lot of different materials, and there is an ambiguity too that I think that you play into really nicely. I mean, your work leaves me with a lot of questions, and I also appreciate that you're using these materials and you're also using lithography that uses stone and these steel frames. And so like, have you always brought material into your work too? And what does like material mean to you? How do you decide to use specific materials to explore these ideas?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think of like printmaking as like this way of like metabolizing the research that I do. And I think there's a lot of like fair criticisms of like research-based art practices that people like Claire Bishop have made, where like a lot of research art has a particular kind of like affect and organization to it. It often leaves you sort of overwhelmed by the amount of information that it's disseminating, and also like it doesn't feel like there's a haptic relationship to the content. Like oftentimes it's just sort of like recontextualized. Whereas like what I try to do in my art practice is to, really like move it through my body and through these processes that I then kind of like take on or mirror or parallel the poetics of the things that I'm looking at. So
interesting.
So like, for example, like I became really interested in making this work through intaglio and specifically aquatint intaglio processes, because I was thinking so much about these like bomb target geoglyphs that I was doing research on, and how like the impacts of these like dummy bombs would then send dust up into the atmosphere, and then depending on the weather, it would get dispersed and then fall down back onto the land. And then in a lot of this work is also kind of rooted in this other project that I made when I was out in New Mexico about history of the Trinity tests and the nuclear complex there, and how it overlapped with and fed into UFO paranoia and those sort of like parallel histories. And so I was thinking about just like the phenomenon of fallout and the poetics of that, and how so much about, like if you're not familiar with aquatint, it's like some real arcane printmaker shit, but basically you take a copper plate and you put it in like a rosin box, which kicks up this sort of particulate dust that then falls back onto the plate. And then how you mask the plate is how you build up tone. And you can do stuff like what I did in some of these prints, which is like litter the plate with aquatint in variable amounts, or like use a mortar and pestle to break up the particulates in bigger and smaller chunks. And that is like in this print what creates this really like kind of like toxic, almost geological effect. And so, and then it also like print is great at removing agency and control. Like I usually come in with this very like fixed image and then like deliberately do things within the process that are going to get me outside of myself. And, I force myself to collaborate with these kind of like, other agents that are outside of my control. And usually like I find more interesting results, more kind of mysterious effects when I'm capitulating to those forces or collaborating with them.
Well, you say that, and yet there's also like such a clear level of control on your work. Like you so clearly know what you're doing, you know this medium really well, and your work is super tight. Yeah. And like the blacks are super black and the whites are super white, and you just have so much control. What's the content of these prints? Like what are these images of? Are they pure abstractions? Are they derived from specific images?
Yeah, a lot of them are derived from like really, like I kind of think of a lot of this work, and this stuff is like more abstract, I would say, than a lot of projects that I've done in the past. But a lot of the forms, like really all of them, are rooted in highly specific images that I found in my research that then I've abstracted, turned into repeat patterns,
and like
mirrored
bombing.
Yeah, so like these ones are actually of actual geoglyphic bomb targets that I've been creating a database and archive of in West Texas and southeastern New Mexico, which are these huge pieces of basically land art that were made by the Strategic Air Command during World War II to test dummy bombs on, and like and test out the Norden bomb site, which was this really crucial instrument that allowed pilots during World War II to figure out like the parabola trajectory of their bomb based on distance and like atmosphere and stuff, and then like hit targets way more precisely. And a lot of these geoglyphic forms are have huge swastikas in the center, and they're just left out there. And so I'm working on another, like a broader project around these geoglyphs. But I was thinking about like, I mean, first of all, I wanted to figure out how to use some of these forms in my work, but I also didn't want to have swastikas in my art.
Yeah.
Fine
line.
Yeah. And so like mirroring something or cutting it in half in a bilateral symmetry is a way of obfuscating and concealing it, concealing the original form. And I started trying to figure out ways within the print process to actually do that literally, to create these kind of like Rorschach images with these forms. And so these are monotypes that I created using stencils that I then created ghost prints of, and then had the stencil hinge so that it was leaving a trace of itself on the print, but then the trace of the, it's hard to explain, but Aaron knows what I'm talking about.
Aaron.
Yeah. So anyways, like the mirroring is like, it's like inherent to the process, but it's hard to, it's like I was trying to figure out ways of like holding both the matrix and the image or the trace of the matrix in the same print. Yeah.
Interesting.
Then these forms that are in in the shockwave triptych prints here, the repeat pattern in the background are from these X-ray images that were created during the Manhattan Project by George Kistakowsky, who's this Russian physicist who headed up the radioactive lanthanum experiments, which developed the implosion device in the plutonium trigger that was like probably the biggest scientific breakthrough towards the creation of the first atomic bomb. And in these images, like they basically were like the seed image for this whole body of work that this is kind of an outcropping of, that I made in Roswell, called Visionary Rumor, because I thought they looked so much just like images of lights in the sky that I was seeing in the UFO museum.
Interesting.
And so I was recognizing these weird, apophenic, like apophenia is this idea that like recognizing patterns in unrelated things based on resemblance and repetition. And so I started recognizing all these things. I started thinking about the geoglyphs as being these like weird military crop circles, and then started to just try and conjure this sense of like the Southwestern uncanny based on this simple association that I was making between these things. And then these forms have just kind of, I don't know, they've stayed with me. Like I've become kind of obsessed with them, and obviously still cutting through the work. So yeah, they seem like maybe flowers or just images of like blooms or something.
Yeah.
But then they're all like highly specific
and destructive and have a destructive background. They don't feel that way when you look at them.
Yeah, and a lot of the other forms are from shaped charge implosion experiments, which is like they basically set up these explosive lenses in perfect radial symmetries so that they would detonate to a point and then create a chain reaction that would explode outward. So that's like a motif too of like that cuts through my work and this project, which is like this idea of narrowing to a point of specificity, and then diffusion and abstraction, and like the oscillation between the two.
How about the stadia rods? First, what are stadia rods?
Yeah. So the stadia rods are their surveyor instruments, and I became aware of them because in the geosciences building at UT, there's like this big bronze statue of this early geologist who's one of the founders of the department, who's holding this rod that's an exact. So I just remade the where is it?
It's got to be one.
Oh, you know what? It's the one that we didn't include in the show. Whoops. Well, it's basically this one.
It's close. Yeah.
Yeah, and it just looked like this big rod that you hold vertically, and what you use an Adelaide, which is this looking device where you can stand at a distance from the rod when it's being held by somebody vertically, and then you measure the distance between 2 points on the rod, so then you can figure out how far the stadia rod point is from where the Adelaide is positioned. And that's how early surveyors in the West started to sort of like project a grid onto the landscape and map it. So I'm interested in like how the history of industrial and military sort of like subjugation of the land in the Southwest, and how to kind of trace that history through these really like specific kind of tools and mechanisms and technologies. And but I thought that like kind of just this simple gesture of like turning them horizontal is like almost like a way of sort of retiring them. Like we've mapped everything at this point, although I did find out recently that with the border wall conflict and proposed construction in Big Bend, they have been putting these kind of grids that look kind of like stadia rod diagrams. They've been like positioning them throughout the land to map the landscape with drones. So they're still doing it similarly, where it's just like you need like a binary kind of geometric design where the distances between all of the sort of grid points, and then you can use that to to create maps.
It's really interesting. I mean, thinking about your work, looking at your work, and hearing you speak, I mean, there's this weird balance between documentation of just like these objective truths, these things that are happening that you're recording, you're abstracting them, and I can't help but see the relationship between like how normal civilians see what our government's doing from like this like I don't know what's going on perspective, like I don't fully understand it, it's too big, and mining techniques and looking at geoglyphs and like as a regular person looking out at the landscape, it's difficult to see things like that because they're so large, scale's difficult to deal with. There's something that is like that is that's being translated through your work too, where I feel like you're again abstracting almost this documentation of history, of what our government's doing, of land. Do you feel that way about your work too? Is that conscious? Is that just my interpretation?
Yeah, I don't know. I've been trying to think through that. Like, I don't really. I think I'm like have a hard time talking about this specific body of work right now because it's like I'm too close to it, and it also feels like this very kind of like whittled down cross section of like what will eventually become a larger body of work. But one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is like how if you think about like the scientific method and the way that like scientists make sense of reality, and they start from a place of wonder and curiosity and unknowing and inconclusivity, and then they narrow down to a point of like technical sweetness, which all those like nuclear physicists talk about. Like when the first atomic bomb was tested, they were like, their like code was basically it was sweet. It was sweet, like there was like a coherence to it. It worked perfectly. Like all of their theories were proved out, know, and then I think about that, and then so like in relation to the poetics of an implosion. I think about my work as this way of like figuring out how to make sense out of what happens when you reach that point of technical sweetness. You invent a new technology, it's tested, proved out, and then it just diffuses into the culture and into the society that it's lodged within, and we have no control over it, basically. And how to make sense out of that and the sort of like vacuum of meaning that emerges, and the vacuum that leaves, the possibility of conspiratorial explanations open, and paranoia and all these things. And so I'm trying to like piece together some sort of meaning there, but I think it's dangerous to come up with any clean resolutions in the way that many people do, and is seductive, like have an easy answer. Yeah, it's really complex things. Yeah. Yeah.
You said something about the start of some of that being the sulfur bag that our sculptor friends gave you.
Yeah.
And then there's the sea salt, which I associate like lamps and sort of, I don't know, like a kind of vernacular of energy.
Yeah.
I think you're interested in that. Are you? And then
yeah.
and then I don't know. I think that in terms of like forming, like maybe to be less specific about like each print having a meaning, like to look at the body of work together. Like I'm interested in mythology that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Like that as an aesthetic.
Yeah.
Paired with the sort of like paraphernalia of maybe some haunted materials or power embedded in them.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, like, can you speak more to that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely with the sulfur and sea salt kind of like conversation that I started, and the sculptures that I started making, pairing those two materials together, I was definitely thinking about how to well, first of all, I was just starting to really think about material histories more seriously, and while I was discovering all this stuff about the political economy of sulfur and, you know, how it flows through our world nowadays, and how that rhymes with its kind of like eschatological Christian apocalyptic associations. I also found out that Himalayan sea salt emerged out of a time in Earth's history called the end Permian extinction, which was 250 million years ago. That was the most apocalyptic extinction event in the history of our planet, and killed off like 95% of organic life, and was like the way that scientists describe what it must have been like to live on Earth during that time is like unfathomable. It's like there's like an epistemological limit you hit there, or you can't actually conceive of it because it's so crazy and alien and estranging. And so I thought it was really funny that this like material that is associated with like, like fine dining commodities and the health producing properties of deionizing lamps or whatever actually was like the mass extinction salt. But then like sulfur too, both of the materials to me have this like really beautiful and kind of like seductive color to them, this pastel kind of color that is disarming. And so I thought that irony and that tension there was interesting. And then the second part of your question, I'm kind of forgetting. Yeah.
That's always great, but
yeah.
I feel like there's just you mentioned ontology.
Oh yeah.
There's more to say about that as an aesthetic.
Yeah.
Our search for like haunting.
Yeah. Totally, yeah. There's like, so hauntology, if those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's like this term that was coined by Derrida, but then like expanded on by people like Mark Fisher. And the kind of like basic thesis of it is that nothing enjoys a completely like positive presence, that there are these absences that like precede and surround everything, that these virtual agents that like dictate so much of reality, right? And so like an example of like and there, like Fisher talks about them like these historical specters that that kind of like persist from previous eras. And I'm interested in time collapsing and eras seeping together, and that is kind of like an aesthetic mode, I think, that a lot of people that are interested in hauntology or fall vaguely under that umbrella do and actively kind of like conjure out of their work. But like, examples would be like the abstractions of like finance or something, or like the specter of like communism or something, these like absences that dictate so much of the world we live in, but are hard to really pinpoint. And then like, like Timothy Morton's theory of hyperobjects is like kind of stems out of that a little bit, and some of the speculative realist shit, and like object-oriented ontology and all those kind of annoying theoretical frameworks. But some of those base ideas are really interesting to me, and there is an aesthetic that a lot of musicians and artists and a lot of musicians specifically, like Mark Fisher, wrote a lot about like burial and caretaker and these people that felt like they were mining the past to like hear these like voices that were whispering from it, in their work, the crackle of like tape loops and stuff. And like I think about that with like visual art. Like I think printmaking is like a kind of way of creating that era seepage, like people think of it as being arcane and stuffy and from a previous era, especially like orthodox traditional print methods, like analog print methods. So, but then I use technology in a lot of my work too. Like a lot of the stuff like wouldn't be possible without it. So, I hope that's present. Yeah. Hey. Yeah. Yeah, I guess it would depend on like which ones exactly, but you know, I think the ones that I mentioned were these X-ray images of implosion tests that were done during the Manhattan Project that I found, and I was thinking a lot about like you know, if there was like this kind of like genesis point for the weird kind of conspiratorial, insane, maddening times that we live in, like that might be it, because it's like where scientific research was formally you know, grafted onto onto state secrecy. You know, like all of a sudden, this thing that was supposed to be democratic and populous and available to everybody then became, you know, classified. And there's like this great scientific historian named Peter Gallison who talks about how like there's more literature being absorbed into the world of the classified world of research than into the Library of Congress every year, you know, by like factors of like 10 or something. It's crazy. I mean, it's hard to pinpoint it because it's all classified, but like his estimates are insane, you know? So it's like this anti-epistemology. And I thought these characters were kind of haunting me because it felt like the implosion trigger really, and these just images, these abstractions felt like this point, like the literal implosion is narrowing into a point that creates a chain reaction, you know, this impossible to conceive of like point in space. And so that, I think that's part of why I became so fixated on them. You know, like I'm reticent to make broad generalizations, like this was the point that then everything went wrong. There was plenty that was wrong before that and would have been if that hadn't happened. But you know what I mean? Like it's kind of it's the classic Orson Welles thing where like anything you say about America is true, you know? So like I try to avoid those kinds of generalizations, but that did seem like this very specific thing that had so many resonances.
Maybe this is more of like a formal question, but there's quite the contrast in color between the deep black of the prints, and then there's even beyond just the material quality of those things, without even knowing what they are.
Yeah.
Quite alluring, just in general. But there's also, I find, a contrast between the Rorschach of the prints and then the very rigid geometries within the connective tissue of those prints. And I was just wondering if, basically, my simple question is, where do the shapes that are inside of the sulfur and the Himalayan sea salt, how do those operate?
Those are all just from stadia rod designs directly. Okay. Yeah, so I did once I found out what a stadia rod was, I was like, what the hell are these things? And why do they look, why did they have to, now they're kind of designed differently, and they also have like, you know, digital technologies that can do a lot of these like mapping processes for you automatically. But the earlier analog stadia rods all had these kind of like beautiful geometric tiling designs in them, and some of them are quite weird and beautiful. And so I just picked the ones that were kind of like the most interesting. But there's really only variations on 2 different designs in there. And like the way that I make these things is like really disgusting. Like the materials are really disgusting. I have to like melt sulfur into molds. I have to pour resin and sea salt into molds, and then I have to like puzzle piece them together into other molds, and then like pour more binding resin and salt into them, and then sand them down, and like I look like I'm cooking meth while I'm doing it all. And so like there's you know, I would like to make more of them basically, but you know, I only had so much time for this show. But yeah, they come straight from stadia rod, actual stadia rods.
I find that to be pretty incredible as well, because that's sort of another thing that like is used to make sense of the world, but then it's like destabilized.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's a classic kind of like all these ways in which we make sense of the world are actually quite illusory and unreliable and, and oversimplify things, and, you know, getting things spot on target. it's like, I mean, you're a printmaker, you know, like registration is something that you never actually do perfectly, you know, like it's just approximate. You know, there's an ideal that you're striving towards, but you always fall short. And so like print holds a lot of that stuff for me, you know, and the targets, like if for the non-printmakers, when you're creating a multi-layer print, you usually, sometimes what you'll do is you'll put targets with crosshairs outside of the image, and then you use those as guides to like line up the two layers perfectly to register them. And it's like one of the most frustrating aspects of print. So that's why I only work in black and white, so I don't have to do that. Yeah. Yeah. A lot in the background of a lot of my art is just like collecting weirdos in my life. And I met this guy named John LeMay, who's like the resident historian and who runs the Southeastern New Mexico Historical Society archive. And he's published all these books on like weird stuff, like cryptids in the Southwest and shit. But then he also and he had to come up with a publishing press name when he published his first book when he was like 22. He's like 40 now, and he's published like 30 books. And I met him at the gym, actually. And he's like really buff. And his publishing press was called like Pumping Iron Press or something. And but he's a really cool guy, and he knew everything about southeastern New Mexico. And so when I moved there and was just sleuthing around and poking around trying to figure out like, what is this weird place that I'm living in, you know, I gravitated towards him and started hanging out with him. And then in his book on the hidden history of southeastern New Mexico, his co-author mentioned in like one line that there are these giant swastika geoglyphs that have just been left out there. And then I went online and I found this forum that was like all World War II historian divorced dads, probably from like 2002. And I found the coordinates for one of them, and then I started doing research with old maps from the 1940s and superimposing them onto Google Earth, and found like 15 more of them. But that was how it started, was with John LeMay and at the gym. Yeah. Yeah.
Always been a printmaker? What did you, what's your history? Always been prints, or what other media have you used?
Yeah, I studied print sort of. Like I'm not actually like really a like a formally trained printmaker. I did a lot of monotype when I was in undergrad, and that was kind of like my foray into print. But I didn't learn how to do stone lithography until a few years ago when I moved out to Roswell and lived there for a while. And now I teach print, and so I've like firmed up the technical stuff to be a better teacher. But then in doing so, have like found out all this stuff about print that's like I really love and has fed into my work. So I do just consider myself more of a like a printmaker now. But then, you know, for the most of my life as an artist, I've kind of been really interdisciplinary. So I've done a lot of video stuff and a lot of sculpture and just drawing. You know, I've been drawing since I was really young, and so yeah, I kind of bounce around a little bit. But this is definitely like a real print, you know. This is like the first show that I've done that's like almost all prints, other than the Stadia routes. But yeah. You know, I haven't. But yeah, I've heard of them, and I mean the sulfur mining started in the Gulf Coast, and a lot of the early sulfur mines were pulling sulfur out of the limestone ore bodies within the salt domes, where also like a lot of the early oil production started that made Texas into what it is, you know. And sulfur mines need a shitload of energy to create like this, to superheat the water that they then hydraulically pump into the ore bodies to pull the sulfur out. So it's like they're bedfellows, you know, and have grown up alongside each other. And there's all those salt dome formations in the Gulf Coast that, so there's another kind of, it's not Himalayan sea salt, obviously, but there is like an overlap there too. Yeah, I'll have to look into that. I've wandered around a lot of weird parts of Texas, but not as much East Texas, to be honest. I've been to Davy Crockett National Park, or State Park. Pretty cool.
What's your relationship to that idea of like your practice? Like, what's that emotional?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that I'm like pretty meticulous and detail oriented, and I think that I have to, like, my tendencies are towards that end of the continuum, and so I identify with scientists, and I've worked with a lot of them in previous projects, and I like talking to scientists, and I think I'm not like anti-science. Like, I do believe that it's valuable, but I am skeptical of it as a framework for entirely explaining reality, and I think there's so much that exists outside of scientific explanations that we should lend credence to, and that artists are maybe like particularly well suited to fill in those gaps. And so, you know, but like I was talking about earlier, like I'm with printmaking, you are oftentimes like striving towards that like point of technical sweetness, or that where you pull the image out from under the press and there's this reveal, and it's this magical moment where you either have like achieved the intended result or not. And I'm always looking for ways to sort of like disrupt my intentionality within the process, because I just have found over the years that like usually what my specific intentions are and the point of technical sweetness that I'm striving towards is not as interesting as if I'm allow for these collaborations with like the with non-human forces to encroach on the process. And print thankfully like offers up, it's both like you know, I think really good for people who are highly planning oriented and meticulous, but also gives you a lot of opportunities for spontaneity and experimentation and inconclusivity and abstraction and incorporating glitches and failures and all this stuff. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Anything else? Well, thanks everybody for being here. You know, thank you, Alex, for the show. It's been amazing. Definitely take your time, look at the work. I know we've learned so much about it. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, everybody. Yeah.